Something unexpected happened on The View that instantly changed the tone of the entire conversation. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn? The kind of moment where a discussion that begins calmly suddenly becomes more serious, more personal, and a little harder to navigate in real time. Moments like that are part of what keeps daytime talk shows unpredictable, and it's exactly what unfolded during a recent segment featuring actor Riz Ahmed and the panel of The View, including longtime co-host Sunny Hostin. Make sure to subscribe to Prime Voice and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. The segment started the way many interviews on the show do. Riz Ahmed had joined the panel to talk about his recent creative work, his approach to storytelling, and the themes he often explores through film and television. The conversation initially focused on the broader entertainment industry and the importance of representation in media, something Ahmed has discussed publicly many times before. At the start, the tone was relaxed. The hosts welcomed him warmly, and the audience responded with the usual applause that comes when a well-known actor walks out on stage. Ahmed sat down at the table alongside the panel, smiling and greeting each host individually. The early part of the conversation centered around his recent projects and the types of roles he's been drawn to lately. As often happens on the program, the hosts took turns asking questions. The discussion moved naturally from career highlights into larger cultural conversations about storytelling, diversity in casting, and how audiences respond to narratives that reflect different backgrounds and perspectives. Ahmed answered calmly and thoughtfully. He explained how his work often tries to bring forward voices that haven't always been represented in mainstream media. He spoke about growing up between cultures and how that perspective shaped the stories he wants to tell. The panel appeared engaged, nodding along as he spoke. One host added that audiences today seem more interested than ever in hearing stories from a wide range of perspectives. Ahmed agreed and elaborated, saying that storytelling becomes more powerful when it allows people to see experiences that might be different from their own. Up to that point, the discussion remained smooth and reflective. But as the segment continued, the conversation shifted slightly when Sunny Hostin raised a more pointed question. Hostin, who often approaches topics from a legal and social perspective, wanted to explore how public figures talk about identity and responsibility in the entertainment industry. Her question was framed in a thoughtful way, but it introduced a more serious tone to the table. She asked Ahmed how he navigates conversations about representation while also addressing criticism that sometimes arises when actors speak publicly about cultural issues. Hostin pointed out that discussions around representation can sometimes become complicated. She mentioned that when celebrities comment on social topics, audiences often expect them to represent entire communities, which can create pressure and, occasionally, disagreement. Ahmed listened carefully while she spoke. He nodded slightly as she laid out her perspective, and when she finished, there was a brief pause. The kind of pause that viewers often notice during live television discussions when someone is considering how to respond. He began his answer calmly, acknowledging the complexity of the issue. He explained that he doesn't believe any single person can represent an entire group of people. Instead, he said the goal should be to create space for many voices and many stories. As he spoke, the other hosts remained attentive, occasionally nodding along. But Hostin followed up with another question that shifted the tone a bit further. She asked whether actors sometimes receive more credit for speaking about social issues than the communities who live with those realities every day. The question wasn't confrontational, but it introduced a sharper edge to the conversation. Ahmed responded respectfully, but this is where viewers could sense the conversation becoming more serious. He clarified that when he speaks publicly, he tries to focus on collaboration rather than positioning himself as a spokesperson for anyone else. He emphasized that storytelling works best when multiple perspectives are involved: writers, directors, actors, and community voices working together to shape a narrative. At this point, Hostin leaned slightly forward, signaling she wanted to add another point. She noted that public conversations about representation can sometimes become symbolic rather than practical, and she asked Ahmed whether the industry is actually changing or simply talking more about change. The question drew a quiet reaction from the audience. Not a gasp, but a subtle shift in attention. It was the kind of moment where viewers could feel the conversation moving away from light promotion and toward a deeper discussion. Ahmed paused again before responding. His tone remained measured, but his answer became more direct. He explained that conversations about representation shouldn't be dismissed as symbolic because dialogue itself can influence decision-makers in the industry. At the same time, he agreed that talk alone isn't enough, and that structural changes inside studios and production companies are necessary. Hostin listened closely but pressed a little further, asking whether actors sometimes become the public face of conversations that should really be happening behind the scenes among executives and producers. That's when Ahmed responded more firmly. He clarified that actors are often asked these questions because they are the most visible part of a project, but the real work happens across many levels of production. He added that while he's willing to engage in public conversations, the responsibility for change belongs to the entire industry, not just the people sitting in front of cameras. The tone at the table remained respectful, but viewers could sense the shift. The conversation had moved from casual discussion into a more pointed exchange of ideas. One of the other hosts briefly stepped in to lighten the moment, noting that conversations about representation are rarely simple and that disagreement can actually help clarify different perspectives. The audience responded with a small round of supportive applause, acknowledging the thoughtful nature of the discussion. Ahmed smiled slightly at that point, but he remained focused on Hostin's question. He reiterated that meaningful progress requires both conversation and action, and he explained that many people within the industry are actively working toward broader inclusion. Hostin acknowledged his point, but added that viewers sometimes want clearer evidence of that progress. Her tone remained calm, but it was clear she was continuing to challenge the topic rather than letting it pass. Ahmed responded again, this time with a slightly more assertive tone. Not confrontational, but firm enough that viewers could recognize he wanted to clarify his perspective. He explained that while public figures can raise awareness, long-term change depends on systemic decisions about who gets funding, who gets hired, and whose stories are given space on screen. At this point in the conversation, the atmosphere at the table had noticeably shifted. The discussion was still respectful, but the rhythm of the segment had slowed slightly as both Ahmed and Hostin carefully considered each response. The audience remained quiet, listening closely as the conversation continued to unfold. And for viewers watching at home, it had become clear that what started as a standard promotional interview was gradually turning into a deeper and more serious exchange about responsibility, representation, and how public conversations shape the entertainment industry. As the segment continued, the panel prepared to explore the topic further, and the moment when Riz Ahmed would respond even more directly to Sunny Hostin's challenge was just beginning to take shape. As the discussion continued at the table on The View, the atmosphere in the studio remained calm, but noticeably more focused than it had been at the beginning of the segment. What had started as a routine promotional interview with Riz Ahmed was gradually becoming a more layered conversation about responsibility in the entertainment industry. And while the tone was still respectful, viewers could sense that the exchange between Ahmed and Sunny Hostin was beginning to move into more detailed territory. After Ahmed had explained that real progress in representation depends on decisions being made behind the scenes, hiring writers, funding different stories, and allowing more creative voices into the process, Hostin nodded but kept the discussion moving forward. One of the reasons viewers often notice her approach on the panel is that she tends to ask follow-up questions that push guests to clarify their position, and that's exactly what she did here. She leaned slightly toward Ahmed and acknowledged that his explanation made sense. But she added that audiences sometimes feel frustrated when discussions about representation sound promising while measurable change appears slower. Her point wasn't framed as criticism of Ahmed personally. Instead, she positioned it as a broader concern about the gap between conversations in the media and the pace of change inside large industries like film and television. Ahmed listened without interrupting, his posture relaxed but attentive. When Hostin finished speaking, there was another short pause, the kind of pause that's common during live discussions when someone is deciding how direct their response should be. He began by agreeing with part of what she said. He explained that frustration is understandable, especially for people who have been advocating for broader representation for a long time. In his view, conversations about inclusion are only useful if they eventually lead to concrete action. As he spoke, the rest of the panel followed along quietly. One host briefly nodded in agreement when Ahmed mentioned that progress can sometimes feel uneven. Another host looked out toward the audience for a moment, as if acknowledging that many viewers likely share similar concerns. But Hostin raised another angle that kept the conversation moving in a slightly more challenging direction. She noted that actors who speak publicly about representation sometimes receive praise from audiences and media outlets, even though the decision-making power often lies elsewhere in the industry. She clarified that she wasn't suggesting Ahmed was seeking that attention. Instead, she said she was curious how he personally handles the attention that comes with speaking about these issues, especially when audiences may interpret those comments as representing entire communities. The question landed carefully but directly. Ahmed responded with a measured tone, but his answer carried a bit more firmness than earlier in the segment. He explained that one of the reasons he chooses his words carefully in interviews is precisely because he understands that people sometimes interpret statements from public figures as broader declarations. He emphasized that no single actor should be expected to represent an entire group of people or experiences. Instead, he said the goal should always be to widen the number of voices being heard, so that storytelling becomes more representative overall. Hostin listened closely, and then asked whether he believes audiences sometimes place too much weight on celebrity commentary when discussing cultural issues. Ahmed nodded slightly and acknowledged that this does happen. However, he also pointed out that actors often end up in these conversations because they are the most visible part of the industry. When people see a film or television project succeed, the actors become the faces associated with the work, even though hundreds of people may have contributed to creating it. The exchange remained thoughtful, but viewers watching closely could see that Ahmed was speaking with a bit more emphasis now, carefully choosing his words while maintaining eye contact with Hostin. One of the other hosts briefly stepped in at that point to broaden the conversation, mentioning that public discussions about representation have become much more common over the past decade. She suggested that this increased visibility may actually be a sign of progress, even if the industry still has a long way to go. The comment drew a small round of agreement from the audience, and for a moment the tension at the table softened slightly. Ahmed agreed with that perspective and added that discussions about representation used to happen mostly behind closed doors. Now, he said, audiences are part of the conversation, which can create accountability for the industry. But Hostin followed up again, this time with a more specific question. She asked whether actors who advocate publicly for inclusion sometimes feel pressure to turn down roles that might not fully align with those values. It was a thoughtful question, but it introduced a personal dimension to the conversation. Ahmed took a moment before answering. He explained that every actor faces complicated decisions when choosing projects. Sometimes a script may contain elements that spark debate, and actors must decide whether they believe the project contributes something meaningful to the conversation or not. He added that storytelling is rarely simple. Even projects that attempt to address social issues can generate disagreement about how those issues are portrayed. At this point, Hostin gently pressed again, asking whether actors have a responsibility to avoid projects that might reinforce stereotypes. The audience grew a little quieter as she asked the question. It was the kind of topic that could easily become uncomfortable if handled poorly, but both participants in the discussion remained calm. Ahmed responded carefully but firmly. He explained that the responsibility for avoiding stereotypes doesn't belong solely to actors. Writers, producers, directors, and studio executives all play a role in shaping how characters and stories appear on screen. He pointed out that when audiences see a finished film or television show, they are seeing the result of many creative decisions made by many people. As he spoke, he maintained a steady tone, but viewers could sense that he wanted to clarify this point strongly. The idea that actors alone should carry the burden of representing entire communities, he suggested, oversimplifies how storytelling actually works. Hostin listened and nodded, acknowledging the complexity of the issue. But she added one more perspective that kept the exchange focused. She said that audiences sometimes feel that actors who speak publicly about social issues are also making a promise that the work they participate in will reflect those values. Ahmed responded by saying that he understands that expectation, but he believes the more productive goal is encouraging diverse voices at every stage of production rather than expecting perfection from individual performers. At this moment in the conversation, one of the co-hosts stepped in again to note that discussions like this are exactly what daytime talk shows aim to create. Respectful exchanges where different perspectives can be explored openly. The audience applauded briefly at that point, and both Ahmed and Hostin smiled slightly, acknowledging the moment. But even as the applause faded, viewers could still sense that the conversation hadn't fully settled yet. Hostin appeared thoughtful, as though she was considering one more question, and Ahmed remained attentive, ready to respond. What made the moment interesting wasn't confrontation or raised voices. Instead, it was the careful way both participants were navigating a complex topic in real time, aware that their words were being heard not only by the audience in the studio, but also by millions of viewers watching from home. And as the segment continued, the exchange between Riz Ahmed and Sunny Hostin was about to become even more direct, as both began addressing the larger question at the center of the conversation: who ultimately carries responsibility for shaping the stories audiences see on screen? As the discussion continued on The View, viewers could sense that the tone at the table had shifted into something more thoughtful and deliberate. The earlier part of the segment had already moved beyond the usual promotional interview format, and now the conversation between Riz Ahmed and Sunny Hostin was settling into a more detailed exchange about responsibility in storytelling and how public figures navigate those expectations. Hostin had just raised the idea that audiences sometimes view actors who speak about representation as making a kind of promise. A promise that the projects they participate in will consistently reflect the values they talk about publicly. It wasn't framed as an accusation, but it was a clear challenge, and it gave Ahmed an opportunity to respond more directly to the expectations that come with being a visible advocate for inclusion in media. Ahmed leaned slightly forward as he answered, keeping his tone calm, but speaking with a bit more clarity than earlier in the segment. He explained that he understands why audiences might interpret those public statements that way. When someone talks openly about representation or fairness in storytelling, viewers naturally want to see those ideas reflected in the work that person chooses. But he also pointed out that creative work often involves complicated collaboration. A film or television series isn't shaped by one individual alone. It's the result of many conversations between writers, directors, producers, actors, and studio executives. Because of that, he said, the final product sometimes evolves in ways that no single participant completely controls. Hostin listened carefully and nodded, but she didn't immediately move on from the point. Instead, she asked whether Ahmed ever feels pressure to publicly explain or defend creative choices when audiences question them. The question drew a noticeable moment of quiet in the studio. Not an uncomfortable silence, but the kind of pause where everyone at the table recognizes that the discussion has become more personal. Ahmed responded thoughtfully. He said that in today's media environment, actors often find themselves discussing their work in greater detail than in the past. Social media, interviews, and public conversations mean that audiences have more opportunities to ask questions about creative decisions. He explained that while he welcomes those conversations, he also tries to approach them with honesty about the limits of any one person's influence on a project. At that point, one of the other co-hosts added a brief comment, saying that audiences sometimes assume actors have more control than they actually do. The comment seemed intended to give the conversation a bit of balance, and Ahmed acknowledged that observation. But Hostin followed up again, bringing the discussion back to a broader cultural perspective. She mentioned that when actors speak publicly about social issues, their voices can carry a lot of influence, sometimes more influence than the voices of people directly affected by those issues. Her tone remained calm, but the question had a clear focus. How does someone in Ahmed's position make sure that influence is used responsibly? Ahmed nodded slowly as he considered the point. When he answered, his response was respectful but noticeably firmer. He explained that one of the most important things public figures can do is redirect attention toward a wider range of voices. Rather than presenting himself as an authority on every issue, he said he tries to highlight the work of writers, filmmakers, and community advocates who are directly connected to the stories being told. He emphasized that representation isn't just about who appears on screen. It's about who gets the opportunity to create the story in the first place. As he spoke, the audience listened closely. The studio remained quiet, with only occasional murmurs of agreement. Hostin acknowledged that point and said she appreciated the distinction he was making. But she also pointed out that viewers often judge the results they see on screen rather than the intentions behind them. That comment prompted Ahmed to respond in a slightly more direct way than before. He said that while audience reactions are important and valuable, it's also necessary to recognize that creative work can sometimes spark debate even when the people involved are trying to approach a subject thoughtfully. Stories that deal with complex social issues rarely produce universal agreement, and in many cases, The goal isn't to present a perfect answer, but to open up space for conversation. As he explained this, his tone remained measured, but there was a noticeable sense of conviction in his voice. It was the first moment in the segment where viewers could clearly see him pushing back on the framing of the discussion rather than simply responding to questions. Hostin listened carefully and then responded with a brief clarification. She said she wasn't suggesting that actors should avoid difficult stories. In fact, she agreed that challenging narratives can be valuable. Her concern, she explained, was about making sure those stories are shaped in ways that reflect the experiences of the communities involved. Ahmed nodded again and responded that he completely agreed with that principle. In fact, he said, one of the most important developments in the entertainment industry over the past decade has been the increasing presence of writers and directors from a broader range of backgrounds. The conversation had now moved away from the earlier tension and into a more reflective tone. Both participants seemed to recognize that they were ultimately discussing the same goal: more inclusive storytelling, even if they were approaching the issue from slightly different angles. Another host stepped in at this point to point out that conversations like this can be difficult to have in short television segments because the topics themselves are complex. She noted that viewers often expect quick answers, while the reality of cultural change tends to be much slower. That observation drew a few nods around the table and a brief round of applause from the audience. Ahmed smiled slightly at that moment and said that he actually appreciates spaces where conversations can unfold gradually, even if they include disagreement along the way. Hostin responded by saying that thoughtful disagreement is often where the most productive discussions begin. The tone at the table softened again after that exchange. For a moment, the conversation seemed to settle into a shared understanding that both sides were exploring different aspects of the same issue. But just as the discussion appeared to be winding down, Hostin introduced one more question, one that shifted the focus slightly back toward Ahmed's personal role in these conversations. She asked whether he ever worries that discussions about representation in media can become symbolic gestures if the broader system doesn't change at the same pace. It was a question that returned the conversation to the central tension of the segment. Ahmed paused before answering, glancing briefly toward the other hosts and then back to Hostin. When he spoke, his response was calm but clear. He said that symbolic conversations can become empty if they aren't followed by real opportunities for new voices in the industry. But he also emphasized that public discussions can help create the pressure that eventually leads to structural change. At that moment, the conversation had reached a point where both participants were speaking very directly about their perspectives. There was still respect in the tone, but viewers watching the segment could tell that the exchange had become more candid than most daytime talk show interviews. And as the discussion continued, the panel and the audience were about to see whether the conversation would resolve into agreement or continue pushing deeper into the complicated realities of representation in the entertainment industry. As the segment continued on The View, the conversation had clearly moved into a deeper space than anyone might have expected when Riz Ahmed first walked onto the stage. The discussion between Ahmed and Sunny Hostin had remained respectful, but it was now focused on the broader question that had gradually emerged throughout the segment: how meaningful change actually happens inside the entertainment industry and how public conversations contribute to that process. Hostin had just asked whether Ahmed worries that discussions about representation can sometimes become symbolic gestures if the larger system doesn't change at the same pace. It was a thoughtful question, and it reflected a concern that many viewers have expressed over the years when conversations about diversity and inclusion appear frequently in the media. Ahmed had responded by explaining that while symbolic gestures alone aren't enough, public dialogue can still play an important role in pushing industries toward real change. As he spoke, the rest of the panel watched closely, and the studio audience remained quiet, clearly engaged with the conversation. Hostin nodded as he finished his explanation, but she wanted to clarify something further. She said that from her perspective as both a journalist and a legal analyst, she often thinks about accountability, not just good intentions, but measurable outcomes. Her tone remained calm, but her words carried a sense of seriousness that viewers often notice when discussions on the show move into social and cultural topics. She explained that audiences sometimes feel that conversations about representation in entertainment have been happening for many years, yet the industry can still appear slow to change in practical terms. Ahmed listened without interrupting, maintaining the composed demeanor he had shown throughout the segment. When Hostin finished, he leaned forward slightly and began to respond. This time his answer came with a bit more emphasis. He acknowledged that the pace of change can be frustrating. He said that many people working in creative industries feel the same impatience because they want to see opportunities expand more quickly. But he also pointed out that meaningful structural change often happens gradually. Studios, production companies, and networks tend to move cautiously, especially when large budgets and commercial expectations are involved. Ahmed explained that one of the most effective ways to create lasting progress is by supporting emerging filmmakers, writers, and producers from a wide range of backgrounds so that they eventually become decision-makers themselves. As he spoke, one of the other hosts nodded and added that this kind of long-term change can be difficult for audiences to see because it happens behind the scenes rather than on camera. The comment seemed to resonate with the audience, and there was a brief moment of agreement around the table. But Hostin gently returned the conversation to Ahmed's earlier point about public dialogue creating pressure for change. She asked him whether he believes actors should actively use their platform to push studios and networks to move faster. It was another moment where the conversation touched on the personal responsibility of public figures. Ahmed answered carefully but clearly. He said that while actors can certainly use their visibility to highlight issues, he believes lasting change requires collaboration across the entire industry. He explained that when public conversations focus too narrowly on individual actors, it can sometimes distract from the broader systems that actually determine which projects get funded and produced. His tone was still calm, but there was a clear sense that he wanted to draw a firm line around this idea. Hostin acknowledged his perspective, though she pointed out that audiences often look to recognizable public figures when trying to understand whether progress is being made. Ahmed responded by saying that he understands why audiences do that, but he believes the more productive approach is encouraging transparency within the industry about how decisions are made. At this point in the segment, the discussion had reached a thoughtful rhythm. Neither side was speaking over the other, and both seemed committed to exploring the issue rather than debating it in a confrontational way. One of the co-hosts stepped in briefly to comment that conversations like this illustrate how complex cultural change can be. She said that audiences sometimes expect quick solutions, but industries built over many decades rarely transform overnight. The audience responded with light applause, acknowledging the observation. Ahmed smiled and agreed that patience can be difficult when people care deeply about an issue. But he added that progress often happens through many smaller steps rather than one dramatic shift. Hostin then raised one final point before the segment began approaching its closing moments. She said that one of the challenges in conversations about representation is balancing optimism with realism. On one hand, there are clear signs of progress in the industry. On the other hand, many viewers still want to see more consistent opportunities for diverse voices. Ahmed responded thoughtfully, saying that he believes both perspectives can exist at the same time. It's possible to acknowledge improvements while still pushing for further change. He emphasized that discussions like the one taking place at the table were part of that process. As he said this, the atmosphere in the studio softened slightly. The conversation had moved from the earlier tension into something more reflective, with both Ahmed and Hostin appearing to recognize that their perspectives were not necessarily in opposition. Hostin smiled and said she appreciated Ahmed taking the time to discuss the issue in depth rather than offering simple answers. Ahmed returned the smile and said that he values conversations where people are willing to explore complex topics openly. At that moment, another host glanced toward the production team and noted that the segment was beginning to run short on time. That comment signaled to viewers that the discussion would soon need to wrap up, but the thoughtful tone of the exchange had clearly made an impression on the audience in the studio. Before moving on, the host asked Ahmed one final question related to his upcoming projects, bringing the conversation briefly back to the reason he had appeared on the show in the first place. Ahmed answered the question with a lighter tone, mentioning the themes he continues to explore in his work and the importance of telling stories that reflect a wide range of human experiences. The shift back to his creative projects helped ease the atmosphere at the table. The earlier seriousness of the discussion remained present, but the conversation was now returning to a more typical talk show rhythm. The audience responded with a warm round of applause as Ahmed finished speaking. But even as the segment began winding down, it was clear that the earlier exchange between Riz Ahmed and Sunny Hostin had created one of those moments viewers often remember from live daytime television. not because of raised voices or dramatic confrontation, but because of the thoughtful and sometimes tense way a complex conversation unfolded in real time. And as the show prepared to move into its final moments of the segment, the audience reaction and the conversation that would follow after the broadcast were about to add another layer to the story. As the segment approached its final moments on The View, the atmosphere in the studio had noticeably shifted from where it began. What started as a straightforward interview with Riz Ahmed about his work had gradually developed into a thoughtful exchange about representation, responsibility, and the role public figures play in larger cultural conversations. The discussion with Sunny Hostin had been calm and measured throughout, but viewers could clearly sense the seriousness of the topics that had been explored. After Ahmed briefly spoke about his upcoming creative projects, the tone of the segment softened again. The earlier tension that had emerged during the discussion about accountability and representation had eased, and the hosts seemed ready to bring the conversation toward a natural conclusion. One of the co-hosts thanked Ahmed for taking the time to appear on the show and for engaging in what she described as a meaningful discussion. She noted that daytime television often covers a wide range of topics, but moments when guests are willing to explore deeper questions tend to resonate with viewers. Ahmed nodded and expressed his appreciation for the opportunity to have a thoughtful conversation rather than a quick promotional interview. He mentioned that spaces where different perspectives can be shared openly are valuable, especially when the subject matter involves complicated cultural issues. Hostin then added a brief closing comment of her own. She said that while discussions about representation in entertainment can sometimes feel challenging, they are important because audiences care deeply about the stories they see on screen and the people who create them. Her tone was reflective rather than confrontational, and it signaled that the exchange earlier in the segment had been part of a broader effort to explore those concerns rather than to create conflict. Ahmed responded respectfully, acknowledging that audience engagement plays an important role in shaping the direction of the entertainment industry. When viewers speak up about the kinds of stories they want to see, he said, it encourages networks and studios to pay closer attention. As the conversation wrapped up, the studio audience responded with a warm round of applause. It wasn't the kind of loud reaction that comes after a comedic moment, but rather the steady applause that often follows a discussion viewers find thoughtful or meaningful. The host seated at the end of the table then addressed the audience directly, thanking Ahmed for joining the show and briefly mentioning the projects he had discussed earlier in the segment. The production team began preparing to transition into the next portion of the program, and viewers watching from home could see the familiar signals that the interview was coming to an end. Ahmed shook hands with several of the hosts as the applause continued, smiling as the conversation concluded. From a viewer's perspective, the moment stood out not because of dramatic confrontation, but because of the way a typical interview evolved into a deeper exchange. The discussion had included moments where Ahmed responded firmly to Hostin's questions, but it remained respectful and measured throughout, the kind of thoughtful disagreement that daytime talk shows occasionally produce when complex topics arise. After the broadcast ended, the conversation didn't simply disappear. As is often the case with segments from The View, clips from the discussion quickly began circulating online. Viewers who had watched the show live started sharing their reactions across social media platforms. Some people praised Ahmed for calmly explaining the collaborative nature of storytelling and for emphasizing that responsibility in the entertainment industry extends beyond actors alone. Others focused on Hostin's role in the conversation, saying that her questions reflected the concerns many viewers have about whether conversations about representation translate into real change. In many cases, comments from viewers reflected appreciation for the tone of the exchange itself. Rather than becoming argumentative, the conversation allowed two perspectives to be explored in a way that felt thoughtful and balanced. Several entertainment commentators later discussed the segment as an example of how daytime talk shows can provide space for nuanced conversations. Instead of reducing complex issues to quick sound bites, the discussion between Ahmed and Hostin unfolded gradually, allowing viewers to hear the reasoning behind both viewpoints. In the hours following the broadcast, clips from the exchange were shared widely, with many viewers highlighting the moment when Ahmed responded firmly, but respectfully to the idea that actors alone should carry the burden of representing entire communities. Some viewers said that his explanation helped clarify how creative projects are shaped by large teams rather than individual performers. Others appreciated Hostin's insistence on discussing accountability and the need for measurable progress in the industry. Media outlets that cover television programming also took note of the discussion. A few commentators described the segment as one of those moments where a standard interview unexpectedly becomes a deeper conversation. What stood out most, they noted, was the calm tone maintained throughout the exchange. Even when the discussion became more serious, both Ahmed and Hostin spoke carefully and respectfully, allowing the audience to focus on the ideas being discussed rather than on personal conflict. In the days following the episode, the show's producers also addressed the segment briefly during another broadcast, mentioning that viewers had responded strongly to the conversation. One of the hosts noted that discussions about representation and storytelling are likely to continue as the entertainment industry evolves. For Ahmed, the moment became part of a larger pattern in his public appearances, where interviews about creative work often lead into broader conversations about culture and storytelling. For Hostin and the panel of The View, it was another example of how live television can produce unexpected but meaningful discussions when guests and hosts engage openly with difficult topics. Looking back at the segment as a whole, what viewers witnessed was not a dramatic confrontation, but something more subtle. A moment where a routine interview shifted into a genuine exchange of ideas. The conversation began with questions about creative work, moved into deeper territory about representation and responsibility, and ultimately concluded with mutual respect between the participants. And for many viewers watching that morning, the exchange served as a reminder that thoughtful disagreement can still exist in public conversations, especially when both sides are willing to listen as well as speak. Now we'd like to hear from you. What did you think about the discussion between Riz Ahmed and Sunny Hostin on The View? Did you agree with Ahmed's perspective on shared responsibility in the entertainment industry? Or did Hostin raise concerns that deserve more attention? Share your opinion in the comments, and subscribe to Prime Voice for more narration-based talk show stories.